we go. There's me. I'm going to give you a bit of an update, just news going on with the community releases of Lustre. So I've been working on Lustre since 2006 through all various companies, and I'm one of the co-leads of the OpenSFS Lustre Working Group. So OpenSFS is the main sort of Lustre community organization, and the Lustre Working Group is an organization coordinated by that organization, which is like a forum for any of the companies or individuals involved in Lustre development. So first of all, I want to start by talking about the Lustre 2.15 release. So this the release, major release of Lustre came out earlier this year in June, and this release had really good engagement from the community ahead of the release coming out. So of course, the very strong positive about that was the .0 release that came out was much better than it would have been otherwise. And the reason for this engagement was we'd announced, a year ago that this would be the next long-term support release of Lustre. So a lot of people were very interested in testing it out when we had release candidates and were coming in with late issues. So the somewhat negative side effect of this was that it did take a bit longer than we'd expected, because we had quite a few release candidates as we worked through some of these issues, and it transpired many of these issues that were brought up as blockers in the release were actually, when we dug into them and understood them better, turned out to be very rare bugs that had been around for many years, but just that higher level of testing or different kind of testing maybe had drawn those bugs out, and when we had a fix we did include that. And then the other side effect was, we have our standard processes for our major releases is when we go into our code-free stage, at the end where we have release candidates, the only things that we'll take into the release from that point onward would be critical bug fixes. And so we don't, normally it's fairly routine as a keeping up with the ecosystem. As new versions of Linux distributions come out, we'll move to those, but we pause on that during a code freeze stage, which is usually fairly brief, a matter of weeks. But as it turned out, with a slightly protracted code freeze phase and sod's law, I guess, every distribution that we supported had a new version came out. So as it turned out, it looked a little stale, the Linux distribution support, when the release finally came out, and I'll get on to the next slide a bit more about what we did about that. Just to close on 2.15, so I won't go into any depth about what these features are, because Andreas is going to talk next a bit more depth about the features. But just to sort of say from a sort of high level point of view, that while there were specific features in 2.15, the behavior we've seen from surveys we do about usage of the releases is that people really do correlate around the LTS releases very strongly. So most people will have been using the 2.12 release from the data we have, and so that means that ostensibly, as people start to transition from 2.12 to 2.15, not only is it the new features in the 2.15 release that people are really using much more widely than previously, but it's also those in the 2.13 and 2.14 release. And then I will just show here, this graphic shows code contributions broken out by for the 2.15 release, and you can see there's a number of different organizations who are active and submitting code. And I will particularly point out here Sanger in the UK, one of the organizations who did submit code. Though I will say as well, not only, code contributions isn't the only way to contribute to release. So just like in Alistair's talk earlier on, about if you do spot things in the documentation that are, slightly stale or out of sync, if just by flagging those, that gives us the opportunity to sort of get those tidied up and fixed for the release. So there's a complete, anyone who's using Lustre can contribute in some way to the towards these releases, and I'm happy to chat with anyone on the networking side of things about the specifics around that. So going on to the LTS releases themselves. So firstly, I'm just going to pause here, and I made the statement before from surveys we've done. We do an annual survey as part of the Lustre Working Group. In every February, we circulate and just poll the community to get information about people's usage of Lustre, today and planned. And this is really useful for us to help make more informed decisions about where to prioritize when we're doing testing or whatever, or making decisions. And so the big focus over the last little while has been about the LTS transition and the timing of that. And so we'd made the decision we are going to, last year, that we would switch to 2.15. And so one of the questions we asked at the beginning of this year was what people's plans were when the release came out. At the time of the survey, the release was not available, but we anticipated it would be available imminently. And so you see here this blue section here, 28% came back and said they would move to the release as soon as it was out. And then the purple section was the much more risk averse, who said we're going to stay on 2.12 as long as we can, like until you force us to move. And then slightly like the majority were more in a sort of wait and see sort of mode. So this was people's thinking before it was a reality, and so it'd be kind of interesting to just see in the room. And I know that there's like slight complications if you are using vendor releases. You're a little constrained by what's available, but just out of interest, who would be using in the room is using a community 2.12 release in production today? Okay, all right. So has anyone yet tried using a community 2.15 release? Very good. Anything to say, Will or James? Any? Good, thumbs up. It works. There you go. So I did actually. It's always a risk doing these kind of things. You never know when you're going to get back. But at the Lustre BOF at SC a couple of weeks ago, I did do a similar thing in the room as well. And there was about 100 odd people there for slightly over 100 for. And it was a fairly similar thing with slightly bigger numbers. That there was maybe 10 or so people put their hands up that they were using 2.15, and pretty much it seems to work was the feedback. So anyway, going on to the specifics here. So we did very quickly turn around a 2.15.1 release, basically to do a bit of catch up with our Linux distributions. And we are planning to have a 2.15.2 release out probably by the end of the year, primarily to catch up with the Red Hat 8.7 release that just came out. That will be servers and client support. And so again, I did a little straw poll there, but one of the things that we had, just timing-wise, we had missed out on Red Hat 9.0 support for the initial 2.15 release, and so we had got that working and merged to the 2.15 branch, and then of course Red Hat 9.1 just came out, and so we've done the work to get that sort of in draft form, as it were. But we haven't merged that into the branch yet. So I was kind of interested at the BOF to sort of assess from the room if people had a strong immediate need to use that versus whether that was okay to defer to the next release to catch up. So it was actually a surprise. Often when we just move between Red Hat minor versions, there's very limited, maybe 1 or 2 changes. There was like a couple of dozen changes here, so it's quite a bit of work. And so essentially, it would delay the whole release for this sort of maybe more limited use case. So the feedback we got in Dallas was that people were not immediately, anxiously waiting for this. So we were planning to defer this. And the other thing was earlier in the year we'd considered we might well do a 2.12.10 depending on demand, and we think now we probably will not do that because it's quite possible with interop to be able to keep your 2.12 servers and not have to do a bigger upgrade, and just to sort of use the 2.15.2 clients if you needed to use a newer distribution. Okay, and then just to plug the survey, if it's a couple of minutes, a few minutes maybe to complete, and there's no identifiable information supplied, so there's no risk of any spam or anything if you do fill that out. So the major release we're working on at the moment is 2.16. So we're targeting that for Q2 this year. At the moment, this was the combination of Linux distributions we're officially supporting, but I expect almost certainly we'll switch to either Red Hat 9.1 or 9.2 servers and clients rather than Red Hat 8.7 by the time the release comes out into the new year. We have got again some draft work is there ready, but we're just not fully committed and landed. There is a couple of probably the main features in the release. IPv6 support is something that's been talked about for a long time. That's at a pretty advanced stage. There's just a few issues around interoperability with older versions and things to be shaken out. And the optimized directory traversal is sort of improved stat ahead. These patches are there. We actually used them for IO 500 submissions we did. Got some pretty good results around improving stat performance with those. Andreas will talk a bit more about the ins and outs of that. Here's the current roadmap from Lustre.org. So we sort of, earlier in, years gone past when there was a lot more aggressive sort of feature development in Lustre, we did do the major releases every 6-month cadence. We've switched now to a sort of more leisurely sort of every year cadence, and that's sort of, less churn for people to keep up with the release cycle. And it sort of reflects a sort of mature feature set we've got today. And so, yeah, sort of Q2-ish next year, and then it's sort of into early 2024 for the 2.17 release. And again, Andreas will go into a bit more what you can expect there. And so, sort of wrapping up just about community events. So I'm really delighted to see this event happening here today. I think there's quite a lot of enthusiasm about the having, getting together in person and the advantages of networking after the pandemic. In 2021, we had entirely virtual events everywhere, and then this year we did have the US Lug event did end up being online in the end, but other than that, all the other events we've had have been in-person events like this, which I think is a lot more advantageous, because even though you have the technical content from the presentations, you really miss out on the networking side of it when you do have virtual events. And so yes, there's still a Japanese event in a couple of weeks, and or maybe next week, and the only thing the event that seemed disappeared altogether was the Chinese Lug event, which has been on for a number of years, but things are a bit complicated there with hosting events at the moment. And yes, and they've also announced the US Lug will be in San Diego next May. So, and finally, this graphic on the right is this is data I've been putting together since I was working at Sun Microsystems. Actually, we were just talking about Sun at the break. But so this is looking at the top 100 of the top 500 the org file system list and which file systems they're using. And so going back, as on the left is SC10, and the right is the data from just SC22 a couple weeks ago, and the red line is the the percentage of the top 100, so the left side, and the right and the blue bars is the number of the top 10 that are using Lustre. And so this can not always be immediately apparent, because sometimes people are they don't publish that information, but this is I either basically knowing people at the sites or the vendors, and only sharing the data in aggregated form. I've been able to collect this data over the years, and you can see I think this is because of Lustre having a permissive open source license. Basically, people are able to take Lustre and use it for various purposes fairly easily. So there you go. I think that's everything I had for today, and I guess questions and the panel. So.